So let's look at the sources of long-run economic growth. If you look at real GDP over time in human history, we sort of, for what we think was the longest time, this happened, and then all of a sudden this sort of took off. But of course it's not stable, right? We've got these peaks, these troughs, these recessions, these expansions, so that while on average our growth rate is now positive, something around 4% in the U.S., which is very high for an advanced industrial economy, it is definitely not 4% every year. Sometimes it's negative, sometimes it's positive. So what caused this takeoff here, this hockey stick shape of economic growth, and then how can we sustain it? What are the policies at work? Macroeconomics is about understanding both the long-run red trend line and also what causes the short-run green fluctuations. Our best measure is real GDP per capita. So we want to know, what is it? How has it changed in different countries? What's the role of productivity? And then what are the roles of capital, both human and physical capital, and technology in creating that long-run economic growth? It will surprise no one that economic growth is not always and only good. It has costs as well. We're beginning to see those costs can pile up fairly quickly. Here's a look at trend lines. You can see China growth rate really starts surpassing India a little before the year 2000. So that although Chinese growth rates are higher, we think, than the U.S., the U.S. still has a higher real GDP per capita. So what did China do right? And also what is India doing right? They were also experiencing some growth. You can see the U.S.'s growth rate really made some big changes around the Second World War. But before we go too much further, let's do a quick check. So, can you answer this question? You can pause and work on it for a minute by yourself. And the answer is stayed constant. Both GDP and population grew by 5%. Take a look at some data here. You can see the low, middle, and high income countries. So there's so much to talk about with growth, and there's so many different sources and so many ways to get economic growth and so many ways to destroy economic growth around the world. And all we're talking about here is a fairly narrow technical issue, and that is the rule of 70. So what's the rule of 70? That is just a speed question. How fast will the U.S. double if our growth rate is at 2% rather than 3% per year? So this works for any variable that you know the annual growth rate of. You just divide that into 70 and you get the answer is always the number of years for that variable to double. So if your hair is growing at 2% per year, it will double in length in 35 years. That's 70 divided by 2 equals 35. In the GDP world, you can use this for GDP per capita. If it's growing at 3.5% per year, it doubles in 20 years. So the moral of the story is that small improvements in growth do add up fast. And here's a practice question for you. Feel free to pause it, read it, and answer it. And of course, the answer is, just like your hair, 35 years. So let's ask ourselves, what are the sources of that long-run growth? How did we get to 2.5% or 3% or 4% even, rather than 0%? So it will come as no surprise that anything that grows the production possibilities frontier is going to grow your economic growth. In other words, if you have all your resources, your land, your labor, your capital, we describe this as physical or man-made aids to production, and entrepreneurship, then you've got the ingredients. These are your resources which go into this production. And if you're using all of your resources efficiently, then you are producing somewhere on the line, right? But there's a maximum, because there's a maximum of these resources that can be used. So unless you find a different source of resources, unless you find more resources, suddenly there's twice as many people or twice as many physical pieces of capital or more entrepreneurship. That could create a situation where your maximum production is enhanced, and that's economic growth. Well, how do we get there? So we can get there over time with either more resources, right? Or better use of resources, more efficient use of. So labor productivity is specifically that, getting labor, the scarce or limited resource of labor, to produce more than it had before. So labor productivity, which is output per worker. And it turns out that labor is one of the most important ingredients because almost every good uses labor in it. And labor is traditionally about 2/3 of the cost of production of a typical good. And besides labor productivity, we can talk about sort of like what are the other ingredients that perhaps could make economic growth. One of them is just more of capital, more physical capital. So if we spend our today's resources to create computers and robots tomorrow, then we'll have the increased production capacity tomorrow. So this actually grows your PPF the more you spend on physical capital today. The other thing is human capital. This is a new term. So human capital is basically skills embodied in our workforce. So education is a great example of human capital. And what happens is the more education we get, typically the higher the productivity we get. And so this is another way to increase our economic growth. And then finally, technological progress simply means you have found new ways to combine resources to create more goods. So when we figure out how to extract more energy from atoms, there will be an improvement in the efficiency of the economy. We can produce more even if the number of resources we have does not change. So those are some of the sources of long-run economic growth.